Hey everyone, and welcome back to Time Out for Trade. I'm Macy Polinsky, and today we are diving into a hot topic in the world of logistics and global trade, the shifting dynamics between East and West Coast shipping, with ocean carriers seemingly favoring West Coast ports. What does that mean for supply chains, shippers, and the futures of freight? Joining us are two veterans, Jason Troisi, Director of Import Freight Forwarding and a District Manager here at Deringer, and Chris Brennan, Route Development Manager of the Asia Pacific Trade Lane. Together, they are going to unpack why carriers are leaning west and how shipping differs coast to coast. So I'll let you two take it away.
Great. Thank you, Macy. Welcome, Chris. How are you today?
Good. And yourself, Jason?
I'm doing good, thanks. As Macy said, pretty hot topic. So thoughts on why carriers may prefer the West Coast versus the East Coast. And is that true? Do we think that carriers do prefer West Coast routing versus East Coast routing? Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think maybe even before we dive in there, maybe explain East Coast, West Coast. I think East Coast predominantly utilized by Europe. Obviously, it's a lot closer, where the Pacific utilized mainly by the Asia services. Obviously, there's Asia services to the East Coast, but as we'll dive into, quite a bit longer transit to the East Coast than the West. But I think really the West Coast, and with a main focus on Asia, there's just a lot of carriers.
I would agree. I think, carriers prefer the shorter transit time, right? There's transit times on express services between 13 and 15 days. Average is about 15 to 17 days. But that allows the carriers to then maximize the revenue. Equipment return with that shorter transit time, the equipment return back to Asia is faster. Getting the empty containers back to the origin ports for reloading. So it tends to be a more profitable lane. And that's why we see more niche carriers entering that market, right? Because it's a much more uber competitive lane as well.
Exactly. And I think that is definitely a benefit when you can, traditional East Coast ports, say we'll just use Shanghai as an example, to say New York, we're looking at 38 to 44 days, where Shanghai to LA, traditionally 14 to 15 days. So, that's 25 days and quite a bit shorter via the West Coast. But also some challenges on the West Coast. A lot more carriers going in there, maybe a bit more congestion at the rail terminals. I think a lot of the West Coast cargo is moving inland. So you run into those challenges over the rail.
Yeah, about 40% of the cargo that comes into LA Long Beach moves IPI to the Midwest, right? So from an importer perspective, what would you say some of the pros to the West Coast would be?
I would say that the quicker transit, as you mentioned, some of the niche carriers, they're always in the market offering the lower rates when the rates are trending down. So quicker transit, more competitive rates, just because there's more carriers in that trade. Another benefit, let's see.
I think some of the dedicated expedited services, right?
Dedicated expedited, agreed. One comes to mind, Matson, where they do have a dedicated terminal. It's non-union, where they are able to turn a box in 24 hours. I don't know of any East Coast terminals that are doing that. I know Matson offers a service via West Coast to New York that gets there in about 22 days, which is fastest out there. So definitely benefits via the West Coast.
Yeah, that Matson service is certainly a very reliable schedule and service, but comes at a premium price, of course.
Right.
Wow. So people have to weigh that. And, I think from an Asia perspective, the West Coast is obviously the closest option to get cargo to the U.S. So why don't we spin, and I'll talk a bit about some of the cons perhaps to the West Coast as well. Rail congestion at times during peak volume periods, what we call the dwell time, which is the time between the container discharging the vessel versus getting on the rail, can be problematic in the West Coast at times. I think right now we're averaging about 7 days, and so that is a delay to get cargo to the Midwest stuff that's moving on the IPI. And then, West Coast IPI rail cargo, it doesn't have as a reliable service once it gets into places like the Ohio Valley and other places really east of the Chicago Gateway. The service is very strong into the Chicago in the Midwest, but once you have to get on another rail line to go to a place, for example, in the Ohio Valley or Pennsylvania or something, that tends to cause a lot of delays. And then one of the other things looming on the horizon that's been looming for years is some of on the West Coast specifically are the regulatory requirements that some of the states are implementing specifically around emissions on trucks, and the carbon monoxide emissions and electric truck requirements and the expenses that may come along with that, with increased drayage costs and having to replace the existing fleet of trucks. So we see that regulatory environment much greater on the West Coast, probably a bit political in some ways, but we'll avoid getting into that. But that is an example of one of the cons as well. So why don't we switch over to the East Coast and talk about some of the pros there?
Yeah, I think on the East Coast, some of the pros we see is just the amount of ports, a lot of coverage. I mean, you go from, if you want to consider the Gulf in the East Coast, basically from Houston up to Portland, Maine. Boston being the biggest port, Northland on the Northeast. So definitely a lot of options. Another pro is, as Jason mentioned, anything west of the Mississippi or east of the Mississippi is tough to get cargo into. So if you're in Georgia, the Carolinas, Pennsylvania, West Coast, you may face delays, but there is a lot of options via the East Coast. There's not as many niche carriers, but you'll still have all of the major players hitting the East Coast. Also, what we're seeing on the East Coast is a lot of inland depots opening, where traditionally there weren't inland depots, like a Greer or Dillon, South Carolina. I believe it's Crandall, Georgia. Just some of these inland depots that weren't there before, where you don't have to have the higher drayage rate, where now they're opening these smaller rail depots in the inland points on the East Coast.
Yeah, it would appear a lot of those inland IPI East Coast locations, specifically in the Southeast, are popping up as a result of some of the manufacturing that's going on in the Southeast, specifically Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, some of that with the auto industry, but others as well. So it's nice to see both the carriers and the rail opening up services to support those trade lanes too. And I suspect we'll see more of that, as there's a big push, at least right now, to bring more manufacturing into the U.S. So those are pros. From a con perspective, a couple of things that come to my mind is specifically out of Asia anyways, is the longer transit time. Chris had spoke to anywhere from 33 to up to 40 days in some cases, depending on the port of discharge and the origin port. And of course, on the rate side, rates to the East Coast tend to be higher, and carriers have a reason for that. Obviously, the longer transit time results in more fuel, more equipment out of service for that much longer period of time. So I think there's pros and cons to both ports, and I think from a supply chain point of view, importers have to look at, what are their needs, factoring in cost, factoring in transit time, and weighing all those and balancing what fits best for their supply chain and ultimately their customers as well.
No, I think you hit it on the head, Jason. It's a seamless flow of cargo and the client's needs. I mean, we look at Chicago, there's 10 different ways to get there. Vancouver, Prince Rupert, LA, Seattle, New York, Norfolk, they different ways to get there, all have their pros and cons, but relying on your partners to advise you on those is always helpful.
Great. Okay. Well, I think that pretty well summarizes it for today, and we hope you find this helpful and informative, and we'll turn it back over to Macy to close us out.
Thanks, guys. Well, I guess that wraps up another episode of Time Out for Trade. Thank you so much, Jason and Chris, for taking the time to discuss what seems like the ever-evolving East and West shipping conditions. For our listeners, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to find us on social media. You can find us on X, LinkedIn, and Facebook. And reach out to us if you have any questions, feedback, or a topic that you'd like for us to cover. Thanks again, guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.